The presentation I prepared is entitled Challenging Problems Require Challenging Solutions. So clearly this gathering today is about agricultural productivity in one sense. It's agricultural sustainability in a broader sense, and I think as we work our way through this conversation, you'll realize it's really about land use, decisions we make. So let's start with this province. How do people see it? Do they see it for those vistas? Is it cities? Agricultural heritage? Is it about wildlife? Is it oil and gas production? Is it forestry? Again, agriculture. It's about economic growth. That defines Alberta. Maybe it's about finding jobs. Some think it's about water. Some think it's about money. Some, maybe myself, it's about me now. For others, maybe it's about them and their kids and their grandkids. I think one of the biggest problems we have is that in Alberta, our general attitude is it's about all of those, which I think is okay. But the average, the severely normal Albertan thinks that we can do all of that everywhere, all the time. Instead of realizing that the size of Alberta today is exactly the same size it was 150 years ago. It hasn't changed even by a square centimeter in size. It just changes in composition. So the concept that we can do everything everywhere all the time is what holds us back. So let's think about this, Alberta. We're led. We're almost unparalleled in our ability to find risk capital. The money comes into Alberta at a phenomenal pace. Right now it's $250 billion of risk capital sitting on the table. We're eternally short of workers, so we bring in immigrants. Because we have all this money, we need to do something with it. We run it through a natural resource production system, which draws down on our natural resources, our land, our air, our water. We're not California. We are an economy driven by natural resource production. And then we produce commodities. Many of you in this room produce some of these commodities, whether it be livestock or crops, hardwood, softwood, coal, natural gas, conventional oil, bitumen, you name it. We produce commodities. And I'll go quickly through this, I guess. If you look at our last several years, this would be our average. We kill about 1 to 1.5 million head of cows per year, 2 to 3 million head of pigs, 100 million kilos of poultry, around 30 million metric ton of crop, 25 million cubic meters of timber harvested per year, about 160 billion cubic meters of natural gas, 30 million cubic meters of conventional oil, 80 million cubic meters of bitumen, 35 million ton of coal, and about 1,500 petajoules of electricity per year. That's Alberta. You can't find any geography in North America comparable in size that's producing commodities faster than Alberta. We're superheated. Some recent work that the ALCES Group with the embryonic Alberta Land Institute at the U of A demonstrated quite clearly that if you look at where we are today, over the last 100 years, there's been a significant and profound change in many of the ecological bank accounts of Alberta. The area of high-quality soils and the organics in those soils have declined significantly. We've seen a reduction in surface water, and primarily small lentic or standing water, and primarily small lotic or moving water. Those systems are way down in the white area. We've also seen a reduction in mainstream river water flow and the volumes in many of our aquifers where we have more intensive land use. Water quality in general today is entirely different than it was 3 generations ago. And by water quality, I mean nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. The area of both our grassland and parkland systems is significantly reduced, and what remains is highly fragmented. In terms of biodiversity, the overall species richness in the province of Alberta has skyrocketed because of exotic invasives. In terms of native biodiversity, we haven't lost many species, but we've seen a significant reduction in the distribution of many. We need to remind ourselves that those changes in our ecological bank account have occurred through a transition of land use through time. So we are where we are today. I think it's important for us to understand our history. And in so doing, it reminds us that our future is not going to be today. So we're talking about how to grow essentially sustainable agriculture that's going to meet the needs of tomorrow. We don't plan for the past, we plan for the future. And that can only be informed by understanding our past. For many, many thousands of years, of course, the dominant land use was First Nations. Since about the time glacial ice sheets retreated in the province of Alberta. So we've had land use since glacial ice sheets retreated. They're not a dominant land use on this landscape anymore. They still exist, but in terms of traditional land use activities, of course, Alberta's changed radically. There was a time in Alberta where almost all people, all white people, were involved in one land use, and that was the killing of bison. Basically, it consumed about 85% of all white people in the province of Alberta. That was replaced by another land use called trapping. About the time that occurred, forestry and mining came to Alberta and have been here ever since, and have never been particularly dominant politically. Late 1800s, agriculture comes along, and from a political and economic standpoint, there was a time in the 1940s, 1950s that it was overwhelmingly dominant in terms of who participated with it, what percentage of our provincial GDP it contributed. It's not as important today, relatively, as it was in the 40s and 50s. And as I think everyone in this room knows, the hydrocarbon sector is the land use that drives our economy today. Now, why would it be even helpful to look at this slide? It's to realize that as time marches on, land uses change. Now, since 1800, I mean, the thing about this slide that's misleading is there's always been agriculture. If you have people, you have agriculture, but it's changed. And it hasn't been the agriculture that we knew that came with Europeans. As we march forward, as this population continues to grow, the question worth asking is, how are we going to feed ourselves, both qualitatively and quantitatively, on a landscape that can't ever change in size, but only change in composition? I'm going to show you a time series of Alberta going back to 1905. This is looking at ecological goods and services. This is your provincial bank account of water quality, water quantity, and soil carbon, if you were to factor them in. And we're going to index it against basically 100% one where it was in 1910. And you can see it's not scaled to 1 to 0, it's scaled to 1 to 0.75. I'm going to back it up to show you again. And here we're looking at the sequential decade by decade reduction in ecological goods and services. It's not uniformly distributed across the province. Most of it occurs in the white area. I wonder what's going on there. A lot of people live there, a lot of agriculture, whether it be crops or livestock. These are just the numbers. So we've mined about 20% of our entire provincial bank account in ecological goods and services over the last 100 years. We'll talk more about what's contributing to it. Let's take a look at it again. So this is your great-grandparents and your grandparents and your parents and today. We have land use because we have people. Has the population grown? Yes, it has. Look at the graph first on the right. We've grown from, 50, 60,000 people in the turn of the last century to the 3.7, 3.8 million people today. Let's back up to the 1930s. 70% of all people in Alberta lived in the country. 30% lived in a city. Today, it's the other way around. It's 80% of all people living in the city, 20% living rural, and of that 20%, 14% of them are acreage owners, and the other 6 are farmers. It's a good thing that most people live in the city. You would not want them living in the country. One of the key challenges, as we'll discuss later, to agricultural sustainability is rural residential and the sprawl trajectory that is so rapidly consuming good agricultural soils. Now I'm going to focus on the map. Excuse me. If I stand back here, can you guys still hear me? Okay. Where did first people come? There's basically 2 things people were looking for. Surface water, good soils. They were agriculturalists. Okay. Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, Grand Prairie, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, it goes on and on. So here we get to see the distribution. In the 1930s, again, most people, 70%, were living in rural settings. As time marches on, the Edmonton-Calgary corridor becomes more and more pronounced, and 3 out of 4 all Albertans live there. I wonder what kind of soils we have there. If we grow our human population at the same rate into the future as we did historically, and actually subdue that rate a little bit, we need to grow between basically now and 2055. We need to move to 7.5 million people. And we will. I can't imagine we won't. So between 2005 and 2055, that 5 decades, will put about 4 million people in Alberta. Basically more than we have right now. We will put most of those people in cities. If we're going to grow, boy, I hope they grow into cities. Let's take this biggest hamlet we have in Alberta, that's Calgary. And there's Calgary in the year 1951. Calgary sitting at 93 square kilometers. Let's grow it to where it is today, and there it is sitting at 580 square kilometers. We're talking about direct footprint, not municipal boundaries. And if Calgary were to grow in population and in area into the future at the same pace it has in the past, in 2057, there's Calgary and Cochrane, Airdrie, Okotoks are all inside. I don't pretend to know exactly what the boundary will be, but here I'm just trying to help people understand the relative magnitude. When people see this slide, they go, no, they frequently come up and say, Brad, that's just completely wrong. That could never happen. Perhaps you're right. But if you were to tell your great-grandparents 50 years ago that Calgary would be that size today, they would have told you that could never have happened. Same pattern with Edmonton. Edmonton and Calgary, Calgary more so than Edmonton, are the poster childs of all of Canada on urban sprawl. If you take all settlements today, all farms, not the farm, but the farmyard, the acreage yard in the city, it's 500,000 hectares. It's 5,000 square kilometers. It's the same size of all our irrigated land in the province of Alberta. As we grow it into the future, by 2055, it will become 14,000 square kilometers. We need to pave over another 9,000 square kilometers by 2055. That will happen in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. Not all, but the majority of it. At least 3/4. If we take a quarter section, today mostly occupied by farmers, and give it a value of $1.5 million per I just said a quarter section, I meant a square kilometer. Excuse me. At $1.5 million per square kilometer, someone's going to be buying basically somewhere between $13 and $14 billion worth of land between now and 2055. That'll be land that's going to be bought by developers, and the land they're buying is currently in agricultural production. By agriculturists that will readily tell us that they're there to feed the world, they love the land, but this is their retirement strategy. This is a map of the province showing its soils, all of Alberta. Every square inch is underlain by soils, even that under lakes and even the Precambrian Shield has soils. Some of these soils are really bad. Some are really good. These are the black loams here, producing an inordinate amount of the productivity in Alberta. This shows the distribution of where people live in Alberta. Laying over top of each other, and let's throw on a polygon that looks at maybe 95% of Albertans. And what you realize is that Albertans are overlain on the best of Alberta's agricultural soils. So of that 9,000 square kilometers, somewhere between 5 and 8 will happen in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. Most will grow into agricultural land. So let's look at agriculture, which most of you have a history here. Has it grown? We look at the graph on the right. It's grown. It's like it's not growing as quickly as it used to. So it occupies over 20% of Alberta today, and if you throw in tame pasture, you're looking at around maybe 12 million hectares on a province that's, 66 million hectares in size.